Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Iran marks the 45th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, Israel-Gaza war, death and Israel's search for total victory. Iran marks Islamic Revolution with demand to expel Israel from UN. Israel will send troops into Rafah, Netanyahu vows, promising safe passage. The roots of the Red Sea crisis. Iran marks the 45th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. Deutsche Welle. Hundreds of thousands of people participated in rallies across Iran on Sunday to mark the 45th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. The rallies took place amid rising tensions across the Middle East over Israel's continued war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The processions took place across the country, with major streets and squares decorated with flags, balloons, and banners with revolutionary and religious slogans. In Tehran, crowds waved Iranian flags, chanted slogans, carried placards with the traditional phrases "Death to America" and "Death to Israel" written on them, and burned US and Israeli flags. The Iranian military displayed a range of domestically produced missiles, including the Qasem Soleimani and Sejal ballistic missiles, the Simorgh satellite carrier, and drones. The marchers included soldiers, students, clerics, and senior political and military officials. Israel-Gaza war, death and Israel's search for total victory. BBC. The article discusses the ongoing conflict in the Gaza Strip between Israel and Hamas from the perspective of a journalist reporting from Jerusalem. The author highlights the challenges faced by international journalists in accessing Gaza and the reliance on Palestinian journalists and citizen reporting to provide information. The author also discusses the impact of the war on civilians in Gaza, including the denial of basic necessities such as food and water, and the potential long-term consequences for children who have been traumatized by the conflict. The article also examines the role of the United States in the conflict and its support for Israel, despite criticism of Israel's conduct of the war. The author notes that the U.S. has not attached any conditions to its military and diplomatic support for Israel, and continues to supply weapons to Israel. The author also mentions the allegations made by Israel against the UN agency UNRWA, accusing it of aiding and abetting Hamas, and the impact of the allegations on the agency's funding and aid operations in Gaza. The article concludes by discussing the potential consequences of the war in Gaza for the wider region. The author notes that the conflict has already spread to other countries, with Iran and its allies using the conflict to further their own agendas. The author also mentions the growing tension between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the pressure on Israel to send troops into southern Lebanon. The article ends by stating that there is no immediate prospect of a ceasefire and that the longer the war continues, the harder it will be to control its consequences. Iran marks Islamic Revolution with demand to expel Israel from UN. South China Morning Post. Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi marked the 45th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution by condemning Israel over the Gaza war and demanding its expulsion from the United Nations. He accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza with the support of the United States and other Western countries. Raisi also called for the bombing of Gaza to be stopped and declared that the death of the Zionist regime has come. Iran has presented itself as a main supporter of Hamas in the conflict, which left over 1,160 dead in Gaza and at least 28,176 dead in Israel. Israel will send troops into Rafah, Netanyahu vows, promising safe passage. South China Morning Post. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has promised to provide safe passage to civilians displaced in the southern Gaza town of Rafah, as threats of an Israeli incursion into the town persist. Netanyahu reiterated his intention to extend Israel's military operation to Rafah in an interview on Sunday, despite international concern over potential casualties. Netanyahu said that Israel is working out a detailed plan for the safe evacuation of the civilian population of Rafah. The war in Gaza was sparked by an attack on Israel by Palestinian Islamist group Hamas in October. The roots of the Red Sea crisis. Foreign policy. The Red Sea has a history of crises, including piracy, naval attacks, and smuggling. The recent surge of Houthi militant attacks on container ships is just the latest chapter in the region's troubles. These attacks have significant geopolitical implications and are rooted in the legacy of colonialism in the region. Additionally, the Belt and Road Initiative, often seen as a sinister plot, is actually a blueprint for what every nation needs in an age of uncertainty and disruption. The UK, once a ruler of the waves, is reprising its naval power role as the Houthis threaten global shipping. Cutting or damaging subsea cables in the Red Sea could disrupt data and financial communications between Europe and Asia. Overall, these attacks harm global trade and have a significant regional impact. Labour candidate apologises after Israel comments. BBC. Labour's candidate in the Rochdale by-election, Azza Ali, has apologised for making offensive remarks about Israel in a local party meeting. Ali claimed that Israel had allowed the deadly attack by Hamas gunmen on October 7. The Conservative Party has called for Labour to suspend its by-election campaign and remove Ali's party membership. Labour's national campaign coordinator, Pat McFadden, said Ali's comments were completely wrong and did not represent the party's view. Ali will remain Labour's candidate in the by-election, which is set to take place on February 29. U.S. strikes rile key allies in Iraq. Washington Post. The U.S. airstrikes in Syria and Iraq, which were intended to punish Iran's Quds Force and allied militias for attacks on U.S. troops, have provoked a different reaction in Iraq. Many in the country see the airstrikes as a threat to Iraq's independence and stability. Although many of the mainly Shiite militias in the country are supported by Iran, they are also deeply intertwined with Iraq's society, politics, and government. The strikes have placed the Iraqi government in a predicament and have increased pressure on Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani to confront the U.S. and negotiate a withdrawal of U.S. forces from the country. For the Biden administration, Iraq's reaction highlights the challenges of maintaining a security partnership with Baghdad while dealing with the fallout from the Israel-Gaza conflict and attacks from groups aligned with the Iraqi government. The U.S. officials argue that the airstrikes have targeted Iranian-backed proxy groups and not the Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, an Iraqi umbrella group for militias that are part of the country's government. However, many of the groups targeted in the airstrikes are part of the PMF. The U.S. officials claim that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, has less control over the militias in Iraq than it did under Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in a U.S. airstrike in 2020. They now believe that the IRGC can set parameters for the militias, but they operate more autonomously under Soleimani's replacement, Ismail Qani. The U.S. officials also argue that the Iraqi government has an obligation to prevent violence against U.S. personnel in the country. However, Iraqi officials and analysts argue that Prime Minister Sudani is unlikely to confront the militias given his weak position and his government's focus on stability and economic development. They also argue that some of the most powerful militias want to avoid a clash that would threaten their growing political and economic influence. Iraq was on the verge of achieving an important outcome, the choreographed withdrawal of US-led coalition troops. But the Biden administration cannot be seen to be withdrawing and retreating at a moment of weakness. Biden moving closer to a breach with Netanyahu over Gaza war. Washington Post. President Biden and his top aides are closer to a breach with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu than at any time since the Gaza war began, no longer viewing him as a productive partner who can be influenced even in private, according to several people familiar with their internal discussions. The mounting frustration with Netanyahu has prompted some of Biden's aides to urge him to be more publicly critical of the prime minister over his country's military operation in Gaza, according to 6 people familiar with the conversations, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. Why only a trickle of aid is getting into Gaza? CNN. The Israeli siege of Gaza is preventing aid from reaching the 2.2 million Palestinians in the territory, according to the UN's Undersecretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, Martin Griffiths. Griffiths says the process of aid reaching Gaza is in all practical terms, impossible. Israel placed Gaza under siege on October 9 after Hamas attacked the country, killing 1,200 people and taking over 250 hostages. Israel has since allowed some aid to enter, but much is still blocked. Gaza was reliant on aid even before the siege began, but the current situation has left the population dependent on UN aid. However, the US and other top donors have suspended funding for UNRWA, which is the main agency responsible for aid distribution in Gaza, after allegations by Israel that some staff were involved in Hamas attacks. UNRWA has warned that it may be forced to halt operations due to lack of funds. Griffiths says that the Israeli siege has also led to bottlenecks at border crossings, and that the list of rejected items is growing. Protesters in Israel have blocked trucks delivering aid to Gaza, and there is constant risk from Israeli bombardment. Al-Shabaab claims attack in Somali capital that kills 3 Emirati troops and 1 Bahraini officer. Associated Press. Al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda-linked militant group, has claimed responsibility for an attack on a military base in Mogadishu, Somalia, that killed 3 Emirati troops and a Bahraini military officer. The attack targeted troops at the General Gordon military base and wounded 2 others. Al-Shabaab described the UAE as an enemy for backing the Somali government in its efforts to fight the group. Al-Shabaab was once in control of Mogadishu but was pushed out by an African Union-led force. It remains a militant threat in Somalia and has carried out attacks in neighboring Kenya. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the six-dimensional world, here to bring you the latest news from our dimension. Today, we discussed several key issues, including the 45th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the Red Sea crisis, political controversies in the UK, US airstrikes in Iraq, and tensions between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Let's dive into these topics and analyze their deeper implications. Firstly, we witnessed the massive rallies in Iran to mark the Islamic Revolution's anniversary. The demonstrations were filled with fervor and animosity towards the United States and Israel. The Iranian military showcased its indigenous missile technology, a clear message of defiance to its adversaries. While these displays are meant to consolidate domestic support and project strength, they also exacerbate tensions in the already volatile region. Speaking of tensions, the Israel-Gaza war has been a major flashpoint, with devastating consequences for both sides. The conflict has not only caused immense suffering for civilians, but it has also widened the rift between the United States and Israel. President Biden's frustration with Prime Minister Netanyahu is reaching a boiling point, and his advisors are urging him to voice his concerns publicly. This shift in tone highlights the growing discontent within the Biden administration and the strain on the US-Israel relationship. Moving on, we discussed the Red Sea crisis, which has seen a surge in Houthi militant attacks on container ships. These attacks have significant geopolitical implications and are rooted in the region's troubled history. The Red Sea's strategic importance cannot be underestimated, with global trade and communication networks heavily reliant on its stability. As tensions escalate, it's crucial to find a balance between security and maintaining global trade flows. In the UK, we saw a Labour candidate in the Rochdale by-election apologise for offensive comments about Israel. This incident underscores the ongoing sensitivity surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the need for careful and respectful dialogue. Political leaders must be held accountable for their words and actions, especially when they perpetuate tensions and deepen divisions. On the international stage, US airstrikes in Syria and Iraq targeting Iran-backed militias have caused a stir in Iraq. Many Iraqis view these strikes as a threat to their country's independence and stability. The situation places Prime Minister Soudani in a challenging position, torn between domestic pressures and the need to maintain a security partnership with the US. The Biden administration must carefully navigate this complex landscape to avoid further destabilization. Lastly, we discussed the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where aid delivery is being severely hindered by the Israeli siege. The UN has noted that aid reaching Gaza is practically impossible, leaving the population dependent on limited resources. The suspension of funding for aid agencies, such as UNRWA, further exacerbates the crisis. It is crucial for all parties involved to prioritize the well-being of innocent civilians and find a resolution to alleviate their suffering. In conclusion, the events we discussed today highlight the deep-rooted conflicts and complex dynamics at play in our world. It is essential for leaders and international actors to seek peaceful solutions, prioritize human rights, and work together to de-escalate tensions. As always, I welcome your thoughts and questions. What are your perspectives on these issues? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.